When Cassidy Flynn spotted two figures trapped beneath the rockslide during that violent storm, he had no idea he was about to save the daughters of the most feared Apache war chief in the territory. He couldn't have known that these weren't ordinary women, but warriors nearly 6 feet tall, trained from childhood to fight and kill. What he especially couldn't have predicted was that his simple act of kindness would lead to something that had never happened before in Apache history. Two sisters choosing the same man. Sisters who moved like predators, who spoke in whispered conversations he couldn't understand, who looked at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Because Naya and Kira weren't just grateful for his rescue. They had seen something in this humble rancher that awakened desires they'd never felt before. Something that made them willing to break every rule their people had ever made about white men. And that night, as Cassidy lay exhausted from saving their lives, they would whisper words in the darkness that would change everything he thought he knew about desire, danger, and the thin line between salvation and surrender. Words that would make him understand he wasn't just their rescuer, he was their choice, both of theirs. But first, he had to survive long enough to hear what they planned to tell him, because the daughters of War Chief Ayana didn't choose lightly, and their father had sworn blood vengeance against any white man who dared touch his bloodline. They were about to make Cassidy Flynn an offer that was either the greatest blessing of his life or his death sentence. 3 hours earlier, Cassidy had been checking his cattle fence when the sky split open like a torn seam. The rain came down in sheets so thick he could barely see his own hands. Lightning cracked overhead, and that's when he heard it, screaming that cut through the storm like a blade. He followed the sound to the rocky outcrop near Devil's Canyon, where a massive boulder had broken loose from the cliff face. Two figures lay trapped beneath smaller rocks, their legs pinned, blood mixing with rainwater. In the lightning flashes he saw them clearly. Two Apache women, nearly identical, both taller than any woman he'd ever seen. They had to be close to 6 feet, with powerful builds that spoke of warrior training. The first one, conscious but grimacing in pain, locked eyes with him. Her gaze held no fear, only calculation. She was measuring him, deciding whether he was friend or threat. When he approached, she didn't flinch. "I'm going to help you," Cassidy shouted over the thunder. She said something in Apache, then switched to broken English. "You, leave. Dangerous. For you." But Cassidy was already working, using a fallen branch as leverage to shift the rocks. The second woman was unconscious, a gash across her forehead bleeding freely. Every muscle in his back screamed as he lifted stone after stone, his boots slipping in the mud. The conscious one, Naya, he would learn later, watched him with growing intensity. Not gratitude. Exactly. But something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. As if she was seeing something in him that surprised her. When he finally freed them both, Cassidy faced a choice. His cabin was 2 miles through the storm. Town was 5 miles in the opposite direction, and Doc Henderson would ask questions Cassidy couldn't answer. Questions about why he was helping Apache women, instead of leaving them for their own people to find. He looked at the unconscious one, Kira, and made his decision. The journey back tested every ounce of strength he possessed. He carried Kira first, her dead weight nearly dropping him twice in the mud. Naya limped beside him, refusing his help despite her injured leg. She kept looking back toward the canyon, as if expecting pursuit. "Your people," Cassidy gasped between steps. "They'll look for you." Naya's response chilled him. "They think we are dead." Inside his humble cabin, Cassidy tore strips from his only good shirt to bandage their wounds. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows as he worked, and he became acutely aware of their eyes on him. Even unconscious, Kira seemed to radiate an energy that made the small space feel charged. Naya submitted to his ministrations with warrior stoicism, but when his fingers brushed against her skin while binding her leg, something passed between them, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Why do you help us?" she asked, her English clearer now. Cassidy paused, bandages in his hands. "Because it's right." Something shifted in her expression. In the Apache world, she was accustomed to men who took what they wanted by force. This gentle care from a white rancher was unexpected. As he finished with her wounds, Naya studied his weathered hands, the careful way he avoided causing unnecessary pain. When Kira stirred and opened her eyes, the twin sisters exchanged a look that made Cassidy's pulse quicken. They were planning something, and somehow he was at the center of it. Kira's first words were spoken directly to her sister in rapid Apache, her dark eyes never leaving Cassidy's face. even lying on his simple wooden floor. Wrapped in his spare blanket, she commanded attention. The sisters were magnificent, not just tall but built like warriors, with defined muscles that spoke of years wielding weapons and riding horses across rough terrain. Naya responded in their native tongue, and Cassidy caught the way their conversation grew heated. Kira sat up despite her head wound, studying him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. When she finally spoke English, her voice was deeper than her sister's, with an accent that turned simple words into something almost musical. "You could have left us to die." It wasn't a question. Cassidy set down the bloody bandages and met her gaze. "I don't leave people to suffer." "People," Kira repeated, as if tasting the word. "You see us as people." The statement hit Cassidy strangely. Of course they were people. But as the sisters exchanged another loaded glance, he realized that perhaps not everyone in their experience had treated them that way. Naya struggled to stand, testing her bandaged leg. "We must go before sunrise." "You can barely walk," Cassidy protested, "and your sister needs rest." "Our father," Kira started, then stopped herself. But the slip revealed something important. They weren't just any Apache women. Their bearing, their scars, the way they carried themselves even while injured, these were daughters of someone significant. "Your father will understand," Cassidy said carefully. "You were caught in a storm." Naya and Kira shared another wordless communication, and Cassidy felt excluded from something vital. The space between them crackled with unspoken decisions. "He will not understand finding us here," Naya said finally. "With you." The weight of that statement settled over the cabin like smoke. Cassidy understood the implications. An Apache chief's daughters alone with a white rancher, overnight, injured and vulnerable. It would look like exactly what it wasn't. But as the storm continued to rage outside, practical concerns overtook cultural ones. They couldn't travel in this weather, and Kira's head injury needed monitoring. Cassidy offered them his bed while he took the floor, but both sisters refused. "We sleep here," Kira announced, indicating the space near the fireplace. "Together." Something in the way she said "together" made Cassidy's throat tight. They arranged themselves on either side of the small fire, and he couldn't help but notice how they moved in perfect synchronization, like dancers who'd practiced the same routine for years. As the night deepened, Cassidy lay on his narrow bed, hyper-aware of every sound from the main room. Whispered conversations in Apache, the rustle of blankets. At one point he heard footsteps approaching his door, then retreating. When exhaustion finally claimed him, Cassidy dreamed of dark eyes watching him, of hands reaching across firelight, of voices speaking words he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. He woke to find both sisters standing at the foot of his bed, fully dressed despite their injuries. Dawn light filtered through the single window, and the storm had passed. But instead of preparing to leave, they stood there studying him with expressions he couldn't read. "The storm is over," he said unnecessarily. "Yes," Naya agreed, "but something else has begun." Kira stepped closer, her height making her imposing even in his small bedroom. "You showed us kindness when you had every reason to fear us. You saved our lives when it would have been easier to walk away," Naya added, moving to flank him from the other side. Cassidy sat up slowly, suddenly aware of being trapped between them. Not physically, they weren't threatening him, but emotionally, he felt caught in something he didn't understand. "What are you saying?" he asked. The sisters looked at each other one final time, and some silent agreement passed between them. "We are saying," Kira said, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, "that we have decided something about you." The day passed slowly after the sisters revealed their true identity. Cassidy found himself stealing glances at Naya and Kira as they moved around his cabin with fluid grace, their every gesture reminding him of their warrior training. The weight of knowing they were War Chief Ayana's daughters sat heavy in his chest. As evening approached, the sisters insisted on preparing a meal using supplies from Cassidy's modest pantry. They worked in perfect synchronization, speaking occasionally in Apache, their voices musical in the small space. Cassidy watched them, mesmerized by how they moved like dancers who'd practiced the same routine for years. "Your father," Cassidy said carefully during the meal. "He'll be looking for you." "He will search," Naya confirmed. "But he believes we are dead." The storm was unusual in its violence. "The rockfall covered our tracks," Kira added. "For now, we have time." "Time for what?" The sisters exchanged one of their meaningful looks, but neither answered directly. Instead, they cleaned the dishes in comfortable silence while Cassidy stoked the fire against the growing chill. As full darkness settled over the canyon, Cassidy offered them his bed again, but they declined as before. They arranged their blankets near the fireplace, and he retired to his small bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar out of concern for their injuries. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced with thoughts of what would happen when their people found them, the political implications, the danger he'd unknowingly stepped into, the way their dark eyes seemed to see straight through him. Hours later, he heard soft footsteps approaching his door. His heart hammered as both sisters appeared in the doorway, their tall forms silhouetted by the dying firelight. They'd braided their long hair differently, in a style he didn't recognize, and their eyes held a determination that made his breath catch. Naya stepped forward first, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to tell you something." Kira moved to flank her sister, both of them now standing at the foot of his narrow bed. In the dim light, they looked like goddesses from some ancient legend, powerful and beautiful, and utterly beyond his reach. "We have been thinking," Naya continued, her whispered words carrying clearly in the quiet cabin, "about what we discovered during our vision quest. What we learned about ourselves," Kira added, her voice equally soft but intense. "About what we want." Cassidy sat up slowly, suddenly aware of being trapped between them in the confines of his small bedroom. Not physically threatened, but emotionally overwhelmed by their presence. "What did you discover?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. The sisters looked at each other, and some silent agreement passed between them. When they turned back to him, their expressions held a certainty that took his breath away. Naya leaned closer, her whispered words sending fire through his veins. "We discovered that we both want the same thing." "The same man," Kira added, her voice dropping to something almost intimate as she stepped closer. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cassidy felt the world tilt around him as he processed what they were saying. These magnificent, dangerous women, daughters of the most powerful Apache chief in the territory, were telling him that they both wanted him. "That's impossible," he breathed. "In your world, perhaps," Naya whispered, moving closer until he could feel the heat radiating from her body. "But in ours, when two women choose the same worthy man, they can share him," Kira finished, her whispered confession making Cassidy's chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. The implications crashed over him like a wave. Not just the desire in their voices, but what they were truly offering. A life beyond anything he'd ever imagined. Love multiplied instead of divided. A family unlike any other. "Your father will kill me," he whispered back, caught up in the intimate atmosphere they'd created. Naya's smile was barely visible in the darkness. "Only if he finds out before we convince him you're worthy." "And we," Kira added, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, "believe you are very worthy indeed." As they retreated to their blankets by the fire, leaving him alone with their whispered confession echoing in his mind, Cassidy realized that his life had just changed forever. The poor rancher who'd saved two injured women had discovered they wanted to save him in return, from loneliness, from poverty, from a life half-lived. The question now was whether he was brave enough to accept what they were offering, knowing it meant abandoning everything he'd ever known for a love unlike anything the world had ever seen. Cassidy's mouth went dry. The morning air seemed to thicken around them, charged with possibilities that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the heat radiating from their bodies as they stood close enough to touch. He started, then stopped. What was there to say? That he'd been thinking about them too? That he'd lain awake listening to their whispered conversations, imagining what their words meant? That every time their eyes met, something primal stirred in his chest? Before he could find words, the distant sound of hoofbeats shattered the moment. All three of them froze, the sisters' warrior instincts immediately alert. Naya moved to the window while Kira positioned herself near the door, their synchronized movement revealing years of training together. 4 riders, Naya reported quietly. "Apache. They're following the storm's path." "A search party," Kira said, her hand instinctively moving to where her weapons would normally rest. "They're checking for survivors." Cassidy felt reality crash back around him. "If they find you here, they'll assume you captured us," Naya finished. "Or worse." The hoofbeats grew louder. Through the window, Cassidy could see the riders cresting the hill that led to his small ranch. They moved with purpose, spreading out to cover more ground as they approached his property. "The root cellar," Cassidy said quickly, Behind the cabin. It's hidden by that fallen log. But Kira shook her head. If they search and find us hiding, it will look even worse for you. Then what? Cassidy demanded, panic edging into his voice. The sisters looked at each other, and in that glance, Cassidy saw them make another of their wordless decisions. This time, it filled him with dread. We tell them we sought shelter from the storm, Naya said. That you offered protection as the treaty requires. And if they don't believe that? Kira's smile was sharp as a blade. Then we remind them who our father is, and that harming his daughter's protector would be unwise. The hoofbeats were closer now. Cassidy could hear voices calling in Apache, searching for signs of their missing chieftain's daughters. His hands shook as he tried to smooth his hair, to look like a man who hadn't spent the night in intimate proximity to two of the most dangerous women in the territory. There's something else you need to know, Naya said urgently. About what we decided. Now? Cassidy hissed, hearing the riders approaching his front door. Especially now, Kira said, moving close enough that her breath warmed his ear. Because what happens next depends on whether you want what we want. The words sent fire through his veins even as terror gripped his heart. Outside, he could hear the riders dismounting, their voices growing louder as they approached the cabin. What do you want? He whispered. Naya stepped to his other side, trapping him between them one final time. We want you to understand that in our culture, when two women choose the same man, the front door shook under heavy knocks, and a voice called out in accented English, White Rancher, open your door. They can share him, Kira finished, her words barely audible but burning into Cassidy's consciousness like brands. The knocking became pounding, and Cassidy heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied outside. His mind reeled from Kira's words, even as his body prepared for potential violence. The sisters moved away from him, arranging themselves with strategic casualness around the cabin. To anyone entering, it would look like they'd simply taken shelter with a helpful settler, but Cassidy knew better. They'd just told him that they both wanted him. Together. And now, with Apache warriors about to break down his door, he had to decide if he was brave enough to survive long enough to find out what that meant. The door burst open, and 4 painted warriors filled his humble doorway, their eyes immediately finding the chief's daughters alive and unharmed. And standing between them, looking guilty as sin, was the White Rancher who'd somehow ended up at the center of an impossible situation. The lead warrior's gaze moved between Cassidy and the sisters, calculation replacing relief in his dark eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of judgment. War Chief Ayana will want to hear this story himself. The lead warrior's name was Dakota, and his scarred face showed no emotion as he studied the scene before him. Behind him, 3 younger warriors gripped their weapons, clearly expecting trouble, but their relief at finding the chief's daughters alive was palpable. Naya spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of her bloodline. Dakota, we are grateful for your search. The storm trapped us, and this rancher offered shelter as the treaty requires. Dakota's eyes moved to Cassidy, taking in his torn shirt, the one he'd used for bandages, and his exhausted appearance. The chief believed you were dead. He mourns his daughters. We live, Kira said simply, because of his kindness. She gestured toward Cassidy with something that almost resembled possessiveness. The warrior noticed. His gaze sharpened, moving between the sisters and the White Rancher with growing suspicion. Years of warfare had taught him to read situations quickly, and something about this one didn't feel simple. You will come home now, Dakota decided. All 3 of you. Cassidy's blood turned to ice. I don't think... The chief will want to thank you personally, Dakota interrupted, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. For saving his daughters. The ride to the Apache settlement took 2 hours, with Cassidy mounted on his own horse but surrounded by warriors. Naya and Kira rode beside him, their presence both comforting and terrifying. Every few minutes they would exchange glances with him that held promises he couldn't fully comprehend. Whatever happens, Naya said quietly during one stretch, remember that we chose you. Our father respects courage above all else, Kira added. Show no fear. Easy for them to say. They weren't riding toward a meeting with a war chief who was legendary for his protection of his family. Cassidy had heard stories about men who'd merely looked at Apache women wrong, stories that didn't end well. The settlement appeared suddenly, hidden in a canyon that provided natural defense. Dozens of teepees and more permanent structures dotted the landscape, with cooking fires sending smoke into the clear sky. Children ran between the dwellings while women tended to daily tasks and men worked on weapons and horses. But as their party approached, all activity stopped. Every eye turned toward them, toward the miraculous return of the chief's daughters and the white rancher riding with them. War Chief Ayanna emerged from the largest structure, and Cassidy understood immediately why this man commanded such respect. Tall and powerfully built, with silver threading through his black hair, he moved with the controlled grace of a predator. His eyes found his daughters first, relief flickering across his stoic features. Then those eyes found Cassidy, and the temperature seemed to drop. "Father," Naya said, dismounting with fluid grace despite her bandaged leg. "We have much to tell you." Ayanna approached slowly, his gaze never leaving Cassidy's face. When he spoke, his English was precise and unaccented, revealing an education that surprised many white settlers. "Dakota tells me you sheltered my daughters during the storm." Cassidy dismounted carefully, aware that every warrior in the settlement was watching. "I found them injured, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "Anyone," Ayanna repeated, as if tasting the word. Yet many would not. Many would have seen opportunity instead of obligation. The chief circled him slowly, like a wolf sizing up potential prey. Cassidy forced himself to remain still, to meet those calculating eyes without flinching. "My daughters tell me you asked for nothing in return. They needed help. That was enough." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression. Not warmth. Exactly, but perhaps a grudging respect. "In my culture, when someone saves the life of a chief's family, they incur a debt." Cassidy's throat felt dry. "I don't want payment." "Nevertheless," Ayanna said, stopping directly in front of him, "you will have it." The chief turned to his daughters, who had been watching this exchange with barely contained tension. "Tell me everything that happened." Naya and Kira exchanged one of their meaningful looks, and Cassidy realized they were about to make another decision that would change everything. "Father," Kira said, her voice carrying a formality Cassidy hadn't heard before, "we need to speak of our vision quest." Ayanna's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your vision revealed something?" "Yes," Naya said, moving to stand beside Cassidy in a gesture that was subtle but unmistakable. "It revealed our destiny." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Cassidy felt the weight of the entire settlement's attention. Whatever the sisters were about to say, it would determine whether he left this place alive, or whether he ever left at all. War Chief Ayanna's eyes narrowed as he studied his daughter's positioning. Both Naya and Kira had moved to flank Cassidy, a formation that spoke louder than words to anyone versed in Apache customs. "Your vision quest," he said slowly, "was to seek guidance about your marriages." "Yes." "Father," Naya replied, her chin raised with characteristic defiance. "And we found our answer." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the gravity of whatever was unfolding. Cassidy felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool canyon air. Ayanna's gaze moved between his daughters and the white rancher they flanked. As a war chief, he'd navigated countless complex negotiations, but this was something else entirely. "Speak plainly," he commanded. Kira stepped forward slightly, her warrior's training evident in her posture. "We both choose him." The words hit the gathering like a thunderclap. Cassidy heard several warriors intake breath sharply, and an elderly woman near the largest teepee began whispering urgent prayers. Ayanna's face remained impassive, but Cassidy caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "You both choose the same man." "Yes," Naya said simply, "as our great-grandmother chose with her sister generations ago. When the tribe was small and strong, warriors were few." Cassidy's head spun. He'd never heard of such arrangements, but the way several elders nodded suggested this wasn't completely without precedent in Apache history. "Our great-grandmother shared a husband?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "When survival demanded it," Ayanna confirmed, his tone giving nothing away. "When the tribe's future required unconventional solutions." The chief began pacing, his moccasins silent on the packed earth. Around them, the settlement watched with rapt attention. This was the kind of moment that would be discussed around fires for years to come. "You believe this white rancher is worth such consideration?" Ayanna asked his daughters. "He risked everything to save us," Kira replied. "He asked for nothing in return. He treated us with honor when he could have taken advantage. And," Naya added, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, "he makes us feel things we have never felt before." Cassidy's chest tightened at her words. The confession was more vulnerable than anything he'd expected from these fierce women. Ayanna stopped pacing and fixed Cassidy with a stare that seemed to penetrate his soul. "What do you say to this, rancher? My daughters offer you something that no white man has ever been given. Do you understand what they are proposing?" Cassidy looked at Naya and Kira, seeing the hope and fear mingled in their dark eyes. They were warriors, chieftains' daughters, women who could have any man in their tribe. Yet they stood there offering him something impossible and precious. "I understand they're honoring me beyond anything I deserve," he said carefully. "And I understand that accepting would change everything about my life." "It would make you Apache," Ayanna said bluntly. "You would leave your white world behind. Forever." The weight of that statement settled over Cassidy like a physical thing. His ranch, his life, his identity, everything would change. But as he looked at the sisters who'd somehow claimed his heart in the space of a single night, he realized something startling. He wanted it to change. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then you ride away with our gratitude and our protection," Ayanna replied. "But you never see my daughters again." The choice was laid out stark and simple. Stay and become something he'd never imagined, or leave and spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. Naya reached out and touched his hand, the contact sending electricity up his arm. "The choice is yours," she said softly. "But know that if you stay, you will be loved as no man has ever been loved." Kira stepped closer from the other side. "We will spend our lives showing you that you made the right decision." Cassidy looked around at the faces watching him. Warriors, elders, children who would grow up with this story. Then he looked back at Ayanna, the father who held his daughter's happiness and Cassidy's life in his weathered hands. "I have one question," Cassidy said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Ask it." Cassidy looked directly into the war chief's eyes. "If I stay, if I become Apache, will I have your blessing? Not just your permission, but your blessing." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression. For the first time since the confrontation began, the hint of a smile touched his lips. "You ask the right question, White Rancher." He paused, studying Cassidy with new respect. Any man brave enough to risk his life for strangers, wise enough to seek a father's blessing, and strong enough to handle both my daughters. The chief's smile widened slightly. That man might just deserve what they're offering. Cassidy felt the weight of every eye in the settlement as he looked from War Chief Ayanna to his daughters and back again. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring, pregnant with possibility and danger. "I accept," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "I accept your daughter's offer, and I ask for your blessing." The words seemed to echo off the canyon walls. Several warriors nodded approvingly, while others exchanged uncertain glances. But Ayanna's expression shifted to something approaching satisfaction. "Then you will undergo the trials," the chief announced. "To become Apache, you must prove yourself worthy, not just of my daughters, but of our people." Cassidy's stomach dropped. "What kind of trials?" "3 tests, Ayanna explained, beginning to pace again. "Strength, wisdom, and courage. You will hunt alone and bring back meat for the tribe. You will sit in council and solve a dispute. And you will face a challenge of my choosing." From behind him, Cassidy heard Naya whisper urgently to her sister in Apache. Whatever she said made Kira nod grimly. "Father," Naya said aloud, "he has already shown courage by saving us. Surely, the trials are tradition," Ayanna cut her off. "If he is to be Apache, he follows Apache ways." The chief turned back to Cassidy. "You have until sunset tomorrow. If you succeed, we will hold the bonding ceremony that night." Cassidy nodded, though his throat felt dry. "And if I fail? Then you leave here as you came, alone." The finality of it struck him like a physical blow. But when he looked at Naya and Kira, he saw something in their eyes that steeled his resolve. They believed in him. More than that, they needed him to succeed. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Dakota, perhaps softened by the chief's acceptance, provided Cassidy with traditional hunting gear, a bow, arrows, and a knife. The weapons felt foreign in his hands compared to his familiar rifle, but he forced himself to adapt. As evening approached, Naya and Kira found him practicing his aim behind the settlement. They moved with their characteristic synchronization, flanking him as they watched him shoot. "You're pulling to the left," Kira observed, stepping close enough to adjust his stance. Her hands on his arms sent familiar electricity through his body. "The bow is different from your white man's guns," Naya added, moving to correct his grip. Feel the string. Don't fight it. With their guidance, his accuracy improved dramatically. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, the reality of what lay ahead settled over all three of them. What if I fail? Cassidy asked quietly. Naya stepped in front of him, her dark eyes fierce. You won't. But if I do? Kira silenced him by placing her finger against his lips. Then we will find another way. But tonight, before the trials begin, we want to show you what you're fighting for. The sisters exchanged one of their meaningful looks, and Cassidy felt his pulse quicken. There was something different in their expressions now. A heat that had been building since the moment they'd first whispered about him. Show me what? He asked, though his body already knew the answer. Instead of responding with words, Naya took his hand and began leading him toward a secluded area of the settlement. Kira fell into step on his other side, her presence warm and electric in the cooling evening air. They led him to a small dwelling set apart from the others, a traditional structure but clearly meant for privacy. As they approached, Cassidy realized this must be where the chief's daughters lived, where they had grown from girls into the magnificent women who now flanked him. At the entrance, both sisters stopped and turned to face him. In the fading light, their beauty struck him anew. The strong lines of their faces, the way they moved with predatory grace, the intelligence that burned in their dark eyes. Tonight, Naya said softly, before you risk everything for us tomorrow, we want you to understand what you mean to us. Kira stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. We want you to know what it feels like to be loved by both of us. The words sent fire through Cassidy's veins. All the tension that had been building between them, all the meaningful glances and charged moments, was about to reach its inevitable conclusion. Are you certain? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Both sisters smiled, and in that expression, Cassidy saw everything he'd been hoping for: desire, affection, and something deeper that made his chest tight with emotion. We have never been more certain of anything, Naya replied, taking his hand and leading him toward the dwelling's entrance. As they crossed the threshold together, Cassidy realized that whatever happened in the trials tomorrow, this moment would change him forever. The poor rancher who had stumbled upon two injured women in a storm was about to discover what it meant to be chosen by warriors. Inside the dwelling, soft buffalo hide rugs covered the floor, and a small fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Cassidy's heart hammered as Naya and Kira moved to face him, their eyes holding promises that made his breath catch. This is what we whispered about all night, Naya said softly, her fingers trailing along his jaw. How it would feel to have you here, with both of us. Kira stepped closer from the other side, her hand resting on his chest. We dreamed of showing you how Apache women love, completely, without reservation, without shame. What followed was unlike anything Cassidy had ever experienced. The sisters moved around him with fluid grace, their touches reverent and passionate. They spoke to each other in Apache, their voices low and intimate, including him in their private language through gesture and caress. When dawn broke over the canyon, Cassidy woke between them, their bodies warm against his in the cool morning air. For a moment, he forgot about the trials ahead, lost in the perfection of being chosen by these extraordinary women. But reality returned with the sound of activity outside. Today would determine his future. The hunting trial came first. Armed with the traditional bow, Cassidy tracked a large buck through the canyonlands. His years of ranching had taught him patience and observation, skills that served him well. When he returned with fresh meat, the watching warriors nodded with grudging respect. The wisdom trial proved more challenging. Ayana presented him with a dispute between two families over water rights. Drawing on his experience mediating between ranchers and his natural sense of fairness, Cassidy proposed a solution that satisfied both parties. The tribal elders exchanged approving looks. For the final trial, Ayana led him to a narrow ledge high on the canyon wall. Below is a sacred cave where our ancestors left markings on the stone. Retrieve the white eagle feather that lies there and return it to me. The climb down was treacherous, testing every ounce of strength and courage Cassidy possessed. But as he descended toward the cave, he thought of Naya and Kira waiting above, and found reserves of determination he didn't know he had. When he emerged from the cave with the sacred feather, the entire tribe had gathered to watch. Ayana took the feather and studied it in the fading light, then looked at Cassidy with something approaching pride. You have proven yourself worthy, the chief announced. Tonight, We bind you to our daughters and to our people. The bonding ceremony that evening was unlike anything in Cassidy's experience. With the entire tribe watching, he stood between Naya and Kira as Ayana spoke words in Apache that bound them together according to ancient tradition. When the chief switched to English, his words carried the weight of prophecy. What was 3 separate lives is now one shared destiny. What was division between peoples becomes unity through love. As the ceremony concluded, Cassidy realized how completely his life had transformed. The poor rancher struggling alone on failing land had become something entirely new. A man chosen by warriors, accepted by a people, transformed by love into someone stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. Later that night in their shared dwelling, Naya and Kira lay on either side of him as they had the night before. But now everything was different. They were bound together not just by desire, but by ceremony, by choice, by a love that had grown from a single act of kindness into something that would last lifetimes. "Do you regret leaving your old life behind?" Kira asked softly. Cassidy looked between the 2 women who had claimed his heart so completely. "How can I regret finding my destiny?" Naya smiled and nestled closer. "Our great-grandmother would have approved. She always said that love makes its own rules." As sleep claimed them, Cassidy marveled at the journey that had brought him here. A simple storm, 2 injured women, and a choice to show kindness to strangers had led to a love beyond anything he'd dreamed possible. The poor rancher who had saved 2 Apache sisters had indeed been claimed by them that night. But in truth, they had saved him just as surely, transforming him from a man barely surviving into someone truly alive, truly loved, truly home. Years later, when their children asked how their parents met, Naya and Kira would smile and tell them about a storm that changed everything, about kindness that conquered fear, and about a love so powerful it made new rules for an ancient people. And Cassidy would add that sometimes, the best decisions are made not with the mind, but with the heart, especially when that heart is big enough to love without limits. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.